It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can get a hold of me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you reach out to me through my email, oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. We have today a returning guest. I was saying before, he's like the Steve Martin of the Opperman Report, Trevor Aronson. I met this guy. He came out with the first book was The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism. I think it was a bestseller. Excellent book. Check this out. It's all about how the FBI sets up these terror operations. They got their own guys inside, and then they arrest some guys half out of his mind to begin with, just to make themselves look good. Then he came back with this story. I had him back with this story about Bundy Ranch and how half the guys up there were feds. And the feds set up some kind of TV documentary film crew and went up there and everybody they interviewed up there was some kind of informant or fed to begin with. He's got this other brand new thing we're going to ask him about called Into the Madness, A Killer's Game, A Woman's Obsession, and a Dark Conspiracy. We'll check that out. But he's here to talk about Pulse, the untold story. This thing won a Peabody Award. It was like a podcast, and it's all about that Pulse nightclub shooting. And you know, when you got Trevor Aronson, you're going to get the real deal, what really happened, not what you see all over the news, what they're trying to push on you. So, Mr. Aronson, are you there?
Hey, Ed, I'm here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having you coming back, man. I love having you here. Remind the audience, I know you're from the Intercept, to intercept.com, but tell the audience, who is Trevor Aronson and what are you up to lately?
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for about 20 years. For a good part of that time, I've covered the FBI. And so You mentioned my book, The Terror Factory. That was about, how the FBI sets up sting operations. And I've continued to cover the FBI for both the Intercept as well as for documentary podcast projects like Pulse that we're going to talk about here. And I'm now working on another book about the FBI that will be released in March of 27 or roughly around there.
When you're poking around the FBI, do you have any problems? do they poke back?
I mean, not so far, I mean, that's the other thing too. You don't really know. But, I think, we have, I certainly had brush-ups with, the FBI. We've had sources at the Intercept who've been, prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And so, the types of stories we do have like high impact and they come with risks. And, those risks include risk to sources. And, certainly, given how acrimonious the Trump administration has been toward journalists on the whole, it's an increasingly tough topic to talk about or to write about. That doesn't suggest that, journalists like me have been targeted in ways, that are, illegal or unethical. As far as we know, that hasn't happened. But certainly, it's become increasingly tough to report on the FBI, and even tougher because so few agents want to talk now compared to years previously, because there's just a kind of a there's like a cloud of fear that they will either be fired or face potentially charges like under the Espionage Act. So it's the government has done a good job across administrations. I shouldn't the Biden administration was also guilty of this, of making it harder and harder to do this kind of journalism.
Yeah, Biden's were bad too, but we've never seen anything like this. I was looking at some of the stuff on your Facebook page, these helicopters in Chicago. I was just talking to a friend of mine who lives over there, and she says friends of hers are getting pulled over just because they look Mexican. They're getting pulled over and searched and ID'd, we're in really bad times, man.
No, it's surprising. Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I've been really surprised by some of the Supreme Court rulings, including that one, right, which they, basically legalized racial profiling for immigration enforcement. And we're also seeing, part of what I've been tracking kind of separately from this is obviously we are seeing the FBI being pulled in more and more to immigration enforcement. Yeah. There's been a mandate. I believe it's still on the books that I reported a few months ago that, the FBI agents and field offices were required to participate with a quota of immigration enforcement raids. And a big part of that was just that they wanted FBI jackets in the photographs that they could post on social media of rounding up immigrants as a way of kind of showing force. So you can kind of see the way that the FBI already has been politicized and kind of promoting, specific policies and, creating kind of the environment of fear that I think the Trump administration wants around immigration.
And the federalizing of local police and state police being federalized to also enforce immigration. We have that here in Florida. We're both dealing with that.
For sure. Yeah. And, I in some ways, a lot of the stuff that journalists like I have, journalists like me were warning about that people weren't paying attention or kind of have metastasized in different ways, right? Like, I always viewed it as quite problematic, these joint terrorism task forces that kind of deputize local law enforcement to the feds for the purposes of terrorism investigations. And you're now seeing kind of an expansion of that, now for immigration, and it's kind of the typical government problem, which is that like once you give government power, it's really reluctant to give that power up. And so, there was a huge amount of federal power expansion during the war on terrorism, just because they could say like, well, look, we need these powers to stop the next Osama bin Laden. And Americans were willing to kind of turn a blind eye, even as, journalists like me were saying like, this isn't a good idea. It gets worse from here. And I think we're beginning to see that now.
Yeah, go to TrevorAaronson.com. He's been talking about this stuff I met him 10 years ago. So we've been talking about this for a long time, a little ahead of the curve there. But we got a couple of new projects here. First, before we get into Pulse, the untold story about the Pulse nightclub, Peabody Award winning reporting there. Into the Madness, a killer's game, a woman's obsession, and dark conspiracy. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so I really wanted to find a way to tell a story that got into America's kind of conspiracy brain.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do it in a way that was maybe counterintuitive. And so I'd heard about this shooting in 2022, terribly tragic. It was a mass shooting in Highland Park, Illinois, outside Chicago, a heavily Jewish community. It was during its annual 4th of July parade. And the shooting was perpetrated by a young man named Bobby Crimo. And Bobby had created a series of videos and online clues that effectively created what's known as an alternate reality game. And it was clear that his hope was that the shooting would inspire people to play this game and try to kind of solve it. And then the solution included clues that suggested that the FBI was secretly behind the shooting. And, so obviously this fell into my wheelhouse for two reasons. One, I was looking for a way into talking about the impact of conspiracy theories on American culture. And then obviously this conspiracy theory that he was trying to create intersected with the FBI, which I've covered for a long time. And so the series is what makes up the basis of the series are hours and hours of recorded calls between Bobby Crimo, the mass shooter, and a young woman who was trying to solve the alternate reality game and kind of got sucked into his conspiracy theory and helped promote it even. And so the story is about him, but it's told through the prism of this woman who gets sucked into the conspiracy theory, which, in the storytelling, I had kind of act as a stand-in for, the way a lot of Americans get pulled into conspiracy theories. So anyway, so it was just like, it's about the shooting, but it's also kind of about something much larger and, kind of about the unmooring of Americans from truth and reality through kind of the pervasive effects of conspiracy theories on our culture.
Yeah, we're in a place right now, a lot of people are losing touch with reality. And it's getting worse and worse every day. But now Into the Madness, these recordings, these conversations you talk about, are these real recordings before the shooting or was from prison? What's the deal with this? Or actors?
They're from prison. Yeah, so this particular, no, they're real recordings, they're not actors.
Okay.
So this particular woman had known the shooter prior to the shooting, but not particularly well. They'd met once and they stayed in touch online. And then after the shooting, she reached out to him and over the course of months, recorded hours and hours of conversations with him. And so she participated with me in this project, sat for interviews, and then turned over the recordings. And so the recordings are kind of a window not only into the shooter's world and the conspiracy theory that he was trying to construct, but this woman, Jamie's efforts to solve this puzzle, this game. And in doing so was helping to kind of perpetrate the conspiracy theory itself. And so, there's questions about whether Jamie had kind of, in some ways kind of fallen in love with Bobby Crimo. There's a psychological condition called hybristophilia, which is when someone becomes sexually attracted to people who commit acts of mass violence like this. And so, that's one of the themes we get into. But I think more than anything, I think Jamie really believed that there was more to the story than just this man wanting to, like, you know, kill innocent people for no reason. And so she thought there was more to it, and as a result, really got sucked into the conspiracy theory.
How'd you get involved in this? This is great. How'd you find this story? This is great.
No, so in a really roundabout way, you know, the conspiracy theory that the shooter, Bobby Crimo, was trying to promote was that, you know, this was really an FBI false flag operation, and he had been, he was a fall guy. And so this woman, Jamie, effectively believed that. And so she was trying to find someone who could help her, you know, untangle this. And so she is looking for a journalist online who works on FBI issues, and obviously found me. And so she had come to me, and I quickly realized that the story wasn't that the FBI was responsible. I never thought that was likely. It was more that this was a way in to look at how a conspiracy theory is constructed in real time. And so that's really what the audio documentary does, is it follows Jamie's kind of pursuit and my pursuit with her to investigate this, and, you know, ultimately how she falls into the conspiracy theories trap. I mean, I think that's what made this project so interesting for me, is, like, you know, you hear about Pizzagate and QAnon and various other conspiracy theories, but, like, what if you could trace a conspiracy theory and be there as it starts to take form? And so that's what this show offered us an opportunity to do, was to kind of get behind the scenes as a conspiracy theory was being put together, and you know, and show, you just, like, you know, and use this one conspiracy theory as a way of telling a larger story about how all conspiracy theories are constructed.
Yeah, I was going to say, she probably found you through my show, probably one of my listeners.
It could be.
But what do you call it? You can go to Amazon right this minute, right now. Okay, it's 4.5 hours long. Into the Madness, A Killer's Game, A Woman's Obsession, A Dark Conspiracy. And they got, like, a free trial, too, so you can listen for free tonight. You know, it gets canceled, right? I guess Trevor won't get any money from it, but whatever. But it's free right now. You can go to Amazon right this minute and get this. 4.5 hours of content, so great stuff there. Into the Madness, A Killer's Game, A Woman's Obsession, A Dark Conspiracy. Now, Mr. Peabody, Pulse, the Untold Story. Okay, now, I always do the same I did every time I interviewed your promoter. Tell us the official story, then tell us what the Untold story, what really happened.
Yeah, I mean, so the story that most people know about Pulse is the story that was told in the immediate aftermath. And, you know, I think, like all stories about a major crime, it's usually the first story that takes hold, even if it's not true. And so what happened with the Pulse nightclub shooting is that his father told the media in the hours after the shooting that his son had seen two men kiss on Miami Beach, and that had angered him, and he believed that's what set him off to commit the crime. And then later, the media found several people who claimed that they had seen Omar Mateen at the Pulse nightclub, and including one man who claimed that he had a sexual relationship with Omar. And so all of that created this perception that had lasted, this belief that Omar Mateen, the shooter, was secretly gay, was self-loathing, and had committed the mass shooting as a hate crime, as a crime against the gay community. And to be clear, you know, this is the deadliest attack in the United States against the gay community. And so, you know, 49 people were killed. This was an enormously deadly mass shooting and a tragic event. And, you know, and I think one of the things that's interesting about Pulse, and I say interesting in a way that I should say tragic, is that, you know, I think mass shootings have become so common that it's really easy to forget the last one when you hear about the next one. And, you know, they kind of blur in our mind. And in some ways, like the Pulse mass shooting was one of the last ones that had such an enormous mark on society that, like, people remember that one. And so for that reason, I thought it was a really important case to revisit. And so so I heard rumblings about, you know, problems with this narrative. And what ended up happening in the Pulse case was that the FBI charged his wife, his widow, Noor Salman, with material support for terrorism, alleging that she knew the Pulse nightclub shooting would happen. And in fact, they got her to sign a confession in which she claimed that Omar Mateen had come down and showed her the Pulse nightclub website, showed her that it was Latin night, and, you know, provided evidence that seemed to suggest that the narrative that they pushed forward was true, that that Omar, targeted the club because it was as a gay club. And so that's really the narrative that cemented that this idea that Omar Mateen committed a crime against the gay community, a hate crime against the gay community. It became a symbol of anti-gay violence. One Pulse, a foundation set up after the mass shooting, raised millions and millions of dollars with that narrative. And so, I started talking to Noor Salman's defense lawyer, Charlie Swift, and he was telling me, that I needed to look into this case more. And what he told me, and that got me interested in it, this was years ago when I first started looking into it, was that what he said was that this is an FBI accountability case, that like this narrative isn't true. And the reason that it's not true is that the FBI helped put forward a false narrative because they didn't want to have to answer hard questions about whether they could have stopped the shooting. And so obviously this, I found this immediately provocative and interesting. I also was reminded of James Comey, then the FBI director, holding a press conference immediately after the Pulse shooting saying that, there was nothing that the FBI did wrong and that they would look and see if there was something that they could have done to prevent the shooting, but he didn't think there was anything. And then ultimately the FBI never came forward with any additional information. And what we found out in our series for Audible, Pulse Untold Story, is that, this entire narrative was false. And the reason that it was false, and the most provocative part of this, is that Omar Mateen's father, who was the man who started the whole narrative, had said the reason that his son committed this crime was because he saw two gay men kissing in Miami. That man, Sadiq Mateen, was actually a longtime FBI informant and had worked for the FBI for over 10 years. And he's the one who kind of pushes this narrative forward that ultimately the FBI doesn't correct. And the reason he pushed it forward was that he was acting as a counterterrorism informant. And certainly it would be problematic for his work with the FBI if his son had become a terrorist. And so it was easier for him to kind of create this excuse that Omar Mateen was secretly gay. And then what happened is, a number of media failings contributed to this. Men were coming forward saying they'd seen Omar Mateen at the club. Those journalists weren't corroborating that information. And then the most egregious was Univision did an interview that was quite impactful with a man who claimed that he had a sexual relationship with Omar Mateen. And, he was not able to provide any corroborating information. He didn't have any photographs. It was just a claim that he could not substantiate it. So we interviewed him for this documentary as well. And, it's pretty clear in that interview that, that he wasn't a credible source. And yet, Univision put that forward. And so all of these reports, combined with the shooter's father claiming that the reason he did this was because he saw two gay men kissing, created this narrative that has stuck that, the Pulse nightclub shooting was a gay hate crime that couldn't have been prevented, when in fact what we found out was that, Omar Mateen likely didn't even know the club was gay when he attacked it. And I can go into and if you're interested, I can go into.
I got a million questions, dude.
Yeah.
I got a million questions in. First, if it wasn't the gay motive, what was the motive?
Yeah, so that's left a little bit unknown. I mean, our best theory is that this was a story of a father and a son. Omar Mateen and his father Sadiq had a very, very strange relationship, and if you wanted to hurt your counterterrorism father more than anything else, a good strategy might be to go and become a terrorist yourself. And, ultimately, while only Omar Mateen can say why he committed the crime and he's no longer with us. We'll never know this for sure. Right. But the reasons we think this is a possibility is a couple of things. One is that we know very clearly that he was not gay, and he did not know Pulse was a gay club when he launched the attack. And then when he ultimately talks to 911 operators, not only does he not acknowledge that he attacked a gay club, he also starts mixing up things related to Shia and Sunni Islam. Okay. So if you're an extremist, you would not, and you support ISIS, you would also not support Hezbollah, and you would also not support one of the rival gangs rival terrorist groups on Nusra Front. And so in his phone calls, he mixes a lot of these things up, which clearly shows he was not sophisticated about terrorist groups. And if you are truly a terrorist, you would be. And so then the best explanation we can come to is that this was a kind of sociopathic revenge toward his father.
Okay. Now the father, you said the father was an informant, but wasn't he involved too, like Voice of America or something like that? CIA?
Yeah. So one of his longtime friends in Afghanistan alleges that he believed he was operating some sort of government propaganda campaign. We can't say that for sure, but what we can say is that he was he had a show on a satellite television program that was that was broadcast to Afghan Americans, and in which he was talking about Afghan politics and really kind of pushing a number of kind of U.S. government lines related to that. He was also a very unreliable source. He put together YouTube videos in which he claimed he was the, president in exile of Afghanistan and asking for information in cabinets. And so he was this very murky fellow. But what we know is that he was flying to California about weekly to give interviews or to conduct this satellite TV show. And there really isn't a whole lot of record of him making money other than being an FBI informant. The show he was on was not something that made money in any kind of commercial way. And so, certainly it raises a lot of questions about whether, the information he was putting out, the television show, the YouTube videos, effectively, perhaps propaganda, was being underwritten in some way by the FBI or maybe an intelligence agency.
And where is he today?
He still lives in Florida. He lives in South Florida. We went to his house and we talked to him for this documentary project, and he refused to cooperate with us.
Do we know what he does for a living today? He can't still be working for the FBI.
That's a good question. I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility.
I know. That's the sad part. They gave him a raise after this.
Yeah,
a promotion.
There's no, his family says that he's a financial advisor. But yeah, we don't, we interviewed Satora Yousufi, who was Omar Mateen's first wife before he married Noor Salman, and she describes him claiming to be a financial advisor, but says that she never saw him talk to clients, meet with clients. So, it does raise a number of real, questions. The most logical explanation is that, he was an informant for over a decade, according to the FBI's own admission, the Justice Department's own admissions. And so, that's a long-term informant. That suggests that he was making, money almost as a full-time job from the FBI. We know that informants can make in excess of $100,000 a year. So the most plausible explanation is that he was on full-time payroll with the FBI.
Yeah, that guy Lawrence Ray, he was making like $100,000 a year. Bernie Kerik got him an FBI informant job, and he was making like $100,000 a year, giving him nothing. He had no information to give, and he was just the Sarah Lawrence pimp. That guy.
You can. Yeah, I mean, I've done a number of stories about informants who, they realize that they can make a lot of money. It's not a lot of work. There's no taxes, and as long as you keep your informant happy to some degree. And sometimes, informants give bad information just to keep on the payroll, right?
And I'm sure there's some kicking back too to the guy you're informant to. Why wouldn't
it? Could be. I mean, that would be scandalous if you could show it. But
my goodness.
I've never found evidence of that. But yeah, the other thing that, that's worth noting is informants are paid in cash as well. So you're talking about thousands of dollars in cash.
Yeah, well, they wouldn't be corrupt, these guys, would they? Of course not. Now, the ex-wives, one of them you said they didn't like what she was saying, so they forced her to make a statement and confess to terror. Well, what's that story?
Yeah, so his second wife, Noor Salman, who was married to during the time of the shooting, she has intellectual capacity issues. So she was tested for IQ levels, and it was in the low percentile. And so she is not the most sophisticated person. And what happened during the shooting is they brought her into the FBI office. And well, first of all, they go to her home, and they take her and her son out, and they put her in a police cruiser. And one of the first things she hears is in the parking lot as she's in the police cruiser, the FBI agents the local police that have picked her up are saying that, she overhears them saying that Omar had attacked a gay club. And at that point, she says to them. Like, that doesn't make sense. Omar likes gay people. And the reason she'd said that is that there was a history of Omar saying positive things about gay people. And the reason he said positive things about gay people was that he felt that the gay community had done a really good job of overcoming homophobia and, you know, and kind of creating a movement, and that he believed that Muslims could use the gay community as an example for how Muslims could overcome Islamophobia. And so Noor, having heard her husband say things like that, was immediately surprised that he would attack a gay club. And so she says he likes gay people. She's then brought to the FBI office, and she is interrogated for hours. And ultimately what happens is that the FBI agent writes out a confession, and that confession includes a number of specific claims. One is that Omar, before the crime, had showed her the website of the Pulse nightclub and showed her effectively the calendar, saying that it was going to be Latin night, the night he attacked, which it was. She also claimed that he came down in his outfit and said, "Do I look Spanish?" You know, to suggest, do I look like I'd be okay going to Latin night? In addition, the confession claimed that she obviously then knew that he was going to, you know, commit this act. And she also claimed in the confession that she and Omar had gone to Orlando together and cased the Pulse nightclub, driven around it as if it was a premeditated target. And so, you know, that became the basis for her prosecution. But what's notable about that is one, it was the FBI agent who wrote the confession that Noor then signed. Yeah. The morning that the FBI agent wrote the confession, it was all over the news that it was Latin night at Pulse that night. And so what ended up coming out was that there was no way substantial parts of that confession could be true. As part of Noor's defense, they had access to all of her electronic equipment, Omar Mateen's electronic equipment, and they could not find any evidence that they had those electronic, you know, the laptop, the phones, that they had accessed Pulse nightclub website before. And, you know, we get into the specifics of how websites log visits. And one of the specific things that's notable about this case is that both Noor and Omar Mateen had a very uncommon, unpopular phone. And that model of phone had never visited the Pulse nightclub website before. So there was no evidence that he had actually shown her that website. And then in addition, they were given access to their cell phone ping data when your cell phone pings a tower. And the only time that Omar Mateen's phone pinged the tower near Pulse was the night of the shooting. And so that meant that her claim that they had cased the club together before, you know, was likely not true, because their phones never pinged there at the time. And so ultimately the case against Noor falls apart. The jury finds Noor not guilty. And it was during this trial initially that the FBI and the Justice Department revealed that Sadiq Mateen, Omar Mateen's father, had been an informant. And what's also striking is that there is in Omar Mateen's phone, there was information that the FBI had right away that should have allowed them to know that the Pulse nightclub shooting wasn't a premeditated target, that it was actually a kind of target of opportunity. And the reason they would have known that is that Omar Mateen's phone shows him going to Disney Springs originally, which used to be known as Downtown Disney. It's the nightclub restaurant area of Disney. And he goes there. And when he goes there, in order to get there, he rents a minivan and he buys a stroller. And that stroller was very specific in that it had this covered area below where the baby is that would have allowed him to conceal his rifle. And it appears that his plan was to go to Disney Springs, use the stroller as cover for his rifle, and commit the shooting there. But when he goes there that night, according to security footage cameras, he walks around, sees a lot of cops around, which in downtown Disney there are a lot of cops, or were at the time, and seems to get cold feet, realizes this is a bad plan. And so then he goes back to his car without the baby stroller. He never brought the baby stroller and the gun into Disney Springs. Goes back to his car, and he Googles downtown Orlando nightclubs.
Wow.
And it brings up several results, one of which is Pulse. But before Pulse was a club called Eve, which is downtown, a straight club. And the cell phone data shows that he drove by Eve, but ultimately didn't stop. And the likely reason is that there's no parking around Eve. You have to go to a parking garage and walk like most downtown clubs. And that's when he then continues to Pulse and ultimately commits the shooting there. And, given the data, it does suggest that he was driving around looking for a target once he'd abandoned both Disney Springs and Eve, and Pulse became that target. And the final piece of evidence was that one of the bouncers, the guy in front, Omar originally goes in to Pulse without his gun. And when he gets there, he pays the fee to get into the club. And he asks the bouncer, he's like, where are the girls at? Because he's looking around the club and he doesn't see any women. And it doesn't occur to him that he's in a gay club and that's why there's not many women. And so all of these things, combined, should have had the FBI know right away that this was not a hate crime. This was a target of opportunity. And despite that, they allowed this narrative to persist. That became the accepted narrative, which was that it was a hate crime. And the argument we make in Pulse the Untold Story is that the reason they did that was that it gave them cover, that they didn't have to answer the question of like, how come they didn't stop the shooter? Because in fact, the shooter's father had been an FBI informant. And in fact, the FBI had investigated Omar Mateen twice before as a potential violent actor. And both of those investigations had been dropped because the father, the FBI informant, encouraged the FBI to do so. So there was a clear, failure on the FBI's part not to see the potential violence in Omar Mateen. And they were able to kind of sidestep those questions by allowing this narrative to go forward that it was a gay hate crime.
Okay, wait a minute. So now this whole giant, they're prosecuting this woman. They were letting 49 people die. And it's going to let their bodies, twist in the graves just to cover up that they had a poor performance with their investigation of their informant's kid.
That seems to be the case. Yeah, it's the only explanation for why they would have done this, right? They pressed forward with prosecution of Noor Salman, knowing that the evidence in the case did not support the confession, which was the only true piece of evidence they had that she was in any way involved with this. And it's hard to know why they would choose to do this. I mean, to what degree it was coordinated, other than there are a few facts that suggest that this was part of a larger effort to cover this up. One was that they waited until the last minute to disclose in the trial that Omar Mateen's father had been an informant, and they also kind of waited and reluctantly disclosed that Omar Mateen had been investigated twice by the FBI. One of his coworkers had reported him saying comments about Hezbollah and thought he was somehow dangerous. They investigated him as a result of that. He also, had done some strange things when he was wanted to be a police officer. He kind of harassed some of the staff there. And so there had been several investigations of him as a possible security threat. And all of those investigations were closed in part. And the FBI has acknowledged this because his father, the informant, encouraged them to close it.
Do we know what type of work his father was informing on? What information was he giving them? Were there cases? Did he testify? Anything?
So the FBI has not disclosed any of that information. The only thing that they have disclosed is that he had worked for the FBI for, I believe, 11 years. But we do know that it was related to counterterrorism investigations. One of the things that we do know is that he was accused by members of his community of trying to raise money for causes that seemed to kind of be, he was raising money for, as an example, for a fund in Pakistan that was trying to overthrow the government of Afghanistan. The presumption from people I've talked to who are kind of familiar with how this works or with this case was that he was acting as an FBI informant in the Muslim community in Florida, looking for people who might be interested in terrorism or fundraising. So it's quite likely that there have been prosecutions in the South Florida area related to his work, but none of that has ever been disclosed. But what we do know is that he was assigned to work within the Muslim community in Florida, providing information.
Feels like more questions than answers, It's
a really mysterious case. Yeah. And I think it's worth noting, and this is the one thing that we note in the documentary too. It's like, when someone passes away, their FBI files are no longer effectively limited from disclosure, so
Yeah.
you can request them. And there's a few exemptions that they've had. So one of the things I did years ago was request Omar Mateen's file and, say that, basically that he has passed away, obviously, and, we should have access to his files. And one of the things that the FBI has claimed is that it's an ongoing investigation, and that's why they've kept the files sealed. And the question becomes like, this mass shooting is going on nearly 10 years old. It'll be 10 years in June. What possible way could you still be investigating this case? And so that certainly suggests that there's information in this case file that the FBI does not want out.
That is incredible. Now, Omar, what did Omar do for a living?
He was a security guard. His goal was to become a police officer, but ultimately he did not have the. He tried to go into police academy training, kind of washed out. Then went in the corrections officer training and washed out. And then ultimately was working as a security guard for a large kind of golf course community in South Florida. And that's what he was doing, ultimately when he, at the time he committed the mass shooting.
He was guarding golf balls. Okay. Now, what about, now you said that there were tips that the FBI failed to investigate him. Now, what was the nature of those tips that he was up to something? What was going on with that?
Yeah. So one was that he worked, before he worked at the golf course community, he worked at the courthouse in St. Lucie County, Martin County, Florida. And he had gotten into issues with his coworkers. He alleges that they were making fun of him. He alleges that they were making fun of his religion. And at one point, being mad about that harassment, that alleged harassment, he then claimed that he knew the Boston Marathon bombers, and he also claimed that he was supportive of Hezbollah. He allegedly yelled out to them, "I am Hezbollah." And if anyone's familiar with Islamist extremism, it's pretty weird that someone would support both the Boston Marathon bombers, who were Sunnis, and then Hezbollah, which is a Shia group. So these are incompatible groups. These are very different. But if you don't know a lot about terrorism, maybe you would make that mistake. The FBI then investigated him, and he, an informant, one of his security guard colleagues, ultimately recorded conversations with him at that time. And it was Sadiq Mateen's FBI handler. Remember, Sadiq, his father, is an informant, who then gets assigned the case, and he goes to Omar's apartment to kind of confront him about these recordings. And what's interesting is that Omar Mateen lies about some of the things that he said, and that the FBI had a recording to show that it was a lie. And the reason that's significant is that, what the FBI often does in situations like that is like look to hang the person up for lying, because lying to a federal agent is a crime. You can remember that was the Michael Flynn case, right, during the first Trump administration. And for whatever reason, even though they hung him up on this, they never used that as leverage to get him to be an informant, to do anything. And what was testified to in his case is that Omar Mateen's father ends up showing up at the apartment and encourages the FBI to drop the case. And so, we do have acknowledgement from the FBI that they did end up dropping the case. Nothing ever came of it. One of the more provocative questions, and I say this as to say it's a question, but it's interesting, is that, like, is it possible that Omar Mateen was an informant as well, right? Like, oftentimes what the FBI will do is hang someone up on, making false statements and then use that leverage to get them to be an informant. And so, that's one of the questions we raise as well, is whether there's a possibility that not only was his father an informant, but possibly Omar was as well. And if that's the case, was he also an informant when he committed the mass shooting?
Interesting. But there had to be something going on with this guy. If they went to all that effort to have his coworker make a recording, that's not a cursory investigation. That's because the FBI gets stuff all day long. They get phone calls all day long and stuff.
Yeah,
tips.
I mean, they did a serious investigation. I think I wouldn't want to overstate it though, because I think it's the climate of the post 9/11 era during that time was that, like, any time there was deep suspicion of Muslim communities unfairly. And, when a Muslim was, when someone was reported as a Muslim saying things like that, it required the FBI to do those kinds of investigations. Mm-hmm. There was a kind of policy within the FBI at the time to, not let any lead go uncovered. And so, I think that's what, so they didn't have a great, it's quite likely that they didn't have much basis other than these kind of unconfirmed rumors that kind of sparked the investigation. But I think what's significant about it in the context of the Pulse nightclub shooting is that Omar Mateen wasn't just someone who like popped on the FBI's radar soon after the shooting and they were like, well, we don't know who this guy is. This was somebody that they spent a good amount of time investigating. And, you know, that raises questions about, you know, could the shooting have been averted had the FBI acted differently? And to what degree did his father, as an FBI informant, help shape the Bureau's willingness to kind of turn a blind eye to him?
I got that. Now, what about, was there any connection between him and the Boston bombers? Well, there must have been something.
No.
Nothing.
No, yeah, that appears to be something that he made up. The second investigation of him started when there was a young man named Mona Muhammad Abu Salah who attended the same mosque as Omar Mateen. They knew each other, but not very well. Abu Salah went to Syria and ended up becoming the first American suicide bomber during the Syrian civil war. He was with a group called Nusra Front, which is like a rival group to ISIS. And so that caused the FBI to then launch investigations of who was related to Abu Salah, were there other supposed terrorists in the United States who knew him. And that was the second investigation of Omar Mateen, because they realized that he had known Abu Salah, and so they investigated him as part of that as well, and ultimately closed that investigation. And so the Omar Mateen also ends up mentioning Abu Salah in one of his 911 calls. But what's interesting about it is that Abu Salah had been part of Nusra Front. Omar Mateen was claiming he was pledging his allegiance to ISIS. Like, those two groups were at the time in conflict with each other. So it definitely suggested that Omar Mateen was not really kind of versed on, you know, these groups and their loyalties if he was kind of claiming some sort of affection for both groups at the same time.
And that would also kind of limit the suspicion that he was an informant on those kind of topics.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's, you know, again, like, that's why, you know, it's not a, you know, it's always tough to do a documentary project where you can't answer all of the questions.
Oh no, we got a mess here.
And so the question that we ultimately can answer is exactly why he committed this. But like, for all of those reasons that we're describing here, you know, that's why we've tended to gravitate toward the theory that this was some sort of, you know, almost like an Oedipus complex. He was looking to harm his father in some way.
Back to the father. Now, the only thing that anybody has to hang their hat on a gay motive is the father's comment to the news media that his son saw two gay men kissing?
Yes. So the claim is that was the spark. And then what ended up happening is there were several individual men who claimed that they'd seen Omar Mateen at the club. And each man's story was treated by the media as like an independent story. And so then each story then verified the other. What we later discovered was that those three men actually knew each other, and they would carpool together to Pulse. And so it wasn't exactly an independent source. There seemed to be some, you know, what I suspect is that these men, you know, were not willfully misidentifying Omar, but they thought they'd seen someone who looked like him, and then they talked about it, and they came to the conclusion that it was him, even though it wasn't. And, you know, one of those men told a kind of fantastical story about Omar brandishing a knife at the club. You know, none of that could be verified, but in the mad rush for an explanation of why this happened, you know, the media reported those stories as if they were true, as if they were verified, and that just kind of helped bolster this narrative. And then finally, the linchpin was really this interview with this man who claimed that he had a sexual relationship with Omar. But ultimately, his story wasn't credible. You know, we interviewed him, and there were significant holes that we, you know, showed in his story. And so, you know, these stories, you know, in some ways, this, as we described, this was a media failure, that the media, you know, latched on to this narrative because it was understandable. I think, you know, not only was the reason this narrative stuck was that it felt like it could be true, right? It makes sense that the homophobe would commit an act of violence against a gay club like that. But ultimately it wasn't. And so I think, you know, one of the big story that we try to reveal in this is that, like, it wasn't just the FBI pushing this false narrative. You know, the other kind of bad actor in this was the media that, you know, wanted so desperately to get facts first, facts in quotation marks, I guess, and that they often like got it wrong. And, you know, and then, you know, media ended up kind of using other media stories to corroborate this. And it just created this narrative that, you know, everyone wanted to believe that it was he was a self-loathing gay man who, committed this hate crime. And then, when we spent, months kind of excavating all of this, we realized that none of that could be corroborated and none of that appeared to be true.
Yeah, well, I was there for October 1st in Vegas. The media, they land, they take over the town and they're gossiping back and forth. They're in all the bars, all the restaurants and trying to up each other and trying, rumors circulate, all kind of crazy stories going around. Now, in this case here, especially at the very beginning, a lot of people were making that claim, these conspiracy theorists, that it was a false flag. This was a false flag operation. And one of the things they showed was a video of some men carrying a body in front of the TV cameras. And then once they got past the cameras, the guy got up and started walking away. So people just wanted to get on TV. Did you happen to catch that?
You're talking about the Las Vegas shooting, right?
I'm talking about Impulse. In the Pulse shooting, that some characters, maybe they were partiers at the club or whatever, but they carried their buddy across. And
then he walked away.
Then he got up and walked away. I know.
I don't remember coming over. I don't doubt it. I mean, that is. I mean, I tend to blame Alex Jones more than there's a long history of a knee-jerk reaction to these kinds of events to say that they were some sort of false flag or government, project, right? I mean, which is like we were talking about Into the Madness earlier, and the claim that it was an FBI false flag. I mean, that's like a lot of conspiracy theories work from other conspiracy theories or kernels of truth, and that's an example of that. But yeah, I mean, you hear that almost all the time. I mean, most recently there were lunatic conspiracy theories about Charlie Kirk's assassination.
Yeah. Well, it would have been nice though if the press would have said, "Oh yeah, those guys were just goofing around in front of the cameras," which happens too in every news report. What about civil litigation? Now, usually you can rely on civil litigation later on. They must have sued the nightclub, the insurance company, even maybe the FBI got sued. What kind of civil litigation was there, and what was the narrative of those lawsuits?
Yes, there have been some civil litigation. Nothing has been, substantial in kind of providing any new information.
Really?
A number of people blame the club owners, and I think there's, I think it was an aggravated part of it. For example, there were some code violations. The club had put up a fence that was not permitted. There was an exit door that was blocked. And so, what we've seen come out is that there were some shoddy kind of stuff happening with the owners that may have helped contribute to like the death toll, unfortunately, just because of their kind of flouting of safety and code issues. But, as far as like suits against the FBI, like there has not been any. I mean, one of the people that we talk about in the series, or we interview in the series, is this guy named Adam, who was a Orlando police officer who was working the kind of security detail that night, the off-duty security detail. And what ends up happening in his case is that there was an underage drinker that had gotten into the club, and he chased them off into the surrounding neighborhood. And it just bad timing. That's when Omar Mateen comes into the club with his gun. And so Adam is returning back to the Pulse nightclub as Omar Mateen is opening fire, and he ends up engaging Omar Mateen in a gunfight where they fire at each other, and ultimately neither hit, but he tries to stop Omar. I mean, it's incredibly brave. Omar Mateen has an assault rifle, and he's got his his department issued Sig Sauer, and ultimately he was sued unsuccessfully, but he was sued as kind of negligent duty. This idea that he was responsible for the crime. Yeah. And so I think, one of the things that happened with Pulse, and one of the things we talk about in the audio series, is that there was an effort to find someone to blame, and I think that also contributed to, when something terrible happens like this, we want to point the finger, right? It was the people that ran the club. It was Omar Mateen. And I think in this particular case, what happened was that it kind of obscured the truth. And, what we try to do in this audio documentary series is point out that, look, the people, the organization that probably had more to blame than anyone else, has been left unaccountable, which is the FBI.
Yeah, and people want to point the finger right away. That same night, oh, this is what happened. Let's close this case up, all the experts, yeah. But now I remember you were talking before about the phones pinging at the Eve nightclub, and there was no parking there. I remember seeing that on the news. Okay, so that's been reported. But now, what about now? People are still trying to claim this was a gay motivated, a homophobic motivation, even now, after all these years?
Yeah, I mean, the foundation, which recently shut down, they promoted this idea. The other thing that made this really hard is, there really isn't any one group now that promotes this idea. But one of the things that was a challenge for us in the storytelling is that, there were survivors who were shot, whose life has been changed, and, they want to believe this, right? Like, it gives them kind of meaning for their pain to say, like, well, look, the reason I was attacked was because I'm gay and that person was a homophobe and, and he was hateful. That's a lot easier to kind of wrap your head around when you've had your life transformed by this event than to say, like, well, look, I was just unlucky and he happened, wrong place, wrong time. He happened to go into this club. And, that's the truth. But a lot of the survivors that we interviewed as part of this, and this is part of the story we tell, is like, they don't want to believe it, right? And so that required us to kind of interview them with a kind of level of sensitivity to understand that, because of their pain, they want it to have a kind of meaning. They want it to be about homophobic violence, not about random violence. And I understand that. I can empathize with that, this idea that you saw your friends die and you were shot and you lived and you wanted to think it's more than just a random thing. And I can understand why they want to kind of wrap their pain around that narrative. And I think that's also partly why the narrative has been so, sticky. But I also think, like, revealing that it wasn't that is really important, because I think when we think about mass shootings, it's really easy to think, like, well, that can't happen to me. Like, in this particular case, like, I'm not gay. I wouldn't be at a gay club, so that couldn't happen to me. And I think it really underestimates the reality of gun violence in America, which is that it's so random. It's not that you have to be gay in a gay nightclub. You could be anywhere. And that's what the Pulse nightclub shooting really showed, is that it wasn't so much a gay hate crime as it was just an example of, the randomness of mass violence and how anyone, anywhere can be targeted.
And then how has the podcast been received by the public, and especially the people in the neighborhood, the locals?
Yeah, so we've had, like, a great response. So, it was written about by local media. Audible did a really great job of promoting it, and then it's also won awards, as you mentioned, like the most prestigious being the AMARC award, or excuse me, the Peabody Award, and then it also won an award for from the Society of Professional Journalists called the AMARC Award for investigative reporting, about the best investigative report in Florida. So I feel like we in an age of Twitter, it's sometimes really hard for big investigative projects to break through, especially those that require you to listen to a 4-hour documentary rather than read a 130 character tweet. And so I measure impact more on on kind of the longer tail, and I feel like we have helped correct the narrative. I've had a number of people contact me since it's come out, saying how eye-opening they thought it was, and really that's what we're trying to do. I mean, the type of projects I work on are really the type where, I'll spend a year working on them. And my hope is to do something authoritative, to say, like, the story that you think isn't really what happened. And that's not the type of story that necessarily trends on Twitter, but I think it's the type of story that, ends up having a more lasting effect.
I tell you, I keep saying this almost every week. I am the luckiest man in the world. I get to talk to the most interesting people in the world. Trevor Aronson, award-winning reporter here, a lifelong worker, the Terror Factory, inside the FBI's manufactured war on terrorism, Into the Madness, A Killer's Game, A Woman's Obsession, A Dark Conspiracy, and then this incredible Peabody Award winner, and this ARC, it's called ARC Award, Pulse, The Untold Story. Mr. Aronson, thank you once again, man. You always bring the goods, man. I never disappoint, my friend, so thank you so much.
Of course, anytime. Thanks for having me, Ed.
I'll talk to you again soon. Thank you. Good night.